Welcome to our virtual Cafecito lecture, which has been a part of the Understanding Nuestra Historia series of events, hosted by the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And our guest today, our wonderful speaker, is Nydia Ponton.
Yes.
She is the Palm Beach County archaeologist. So she works here in South Florida, more specifically with the West Palm Beach County, and she is going to talk to us about 19th century slavery in the Caribbean and her work and her experience as a Latina archaeologist here in South Florida. So thank you so much, Nydia, for being here and for teaching us about your wonderful research and your work. So the floor is yours.
Okay, do we want to wait or do we want to start?
We can start.
Okay, perfect. Then first of all, thank you, Natalie, for inviting me. It's an honor to be part of the Cafecito series. It's a little late for me to have a cafecito, but I have a little tea. So, to go with the theme. And thank you for those that are joining us. And if you're watching it recorded, I hope you enjoy it. So my name is Nydia León. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and I completed my undergrad degree in anthropology from the University of Puerto Rico in 2001. I've been doing archaeology since 1998, I think it is. Yeah. So I've been doing this for a little bit. And then I went on to complete my dual degree program from Temple University. I finished my PhD in 2018, and then I moved to Florida in 2019. And now, for a while, I worked with CRM. I don't know if you guys know what CRM is. It's cultural resource management, or what we call in the field contract archaeology. And now I work with the government. So like she mentioned, I work for Palm Beach County, and I joined Palm Beach County a year ago. And I work for the planning department under Chris Davenport. Chris Davenport is the county archaeologist and the county historic preservation officer. And our goal is to identify and protect the archaeological and historic resources within unincorporated Palm Beach County from adverse impacts, to promote public awareness of the benefits of preserving such resources. And I'm going to go a little bit more into detail on our role with the county. So our goal is threefold. We first need to identify, right? To locate, identify, evaluate what sites, buildings, structures, objects, everything that is of cultural development of the county. We need to first identify them, and we have the Florida Master Site File, where every time we identify a site or any cultural resource, they're added to the list, to the database. And if they're of historical significance, we are also responsible of historically designating these structures so they can be protected. So then, in order to protect, we mostly deal with archaeological sites. So our job, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Our job is to enforce the checks and balances that are in place so that we can protect the resources from development. So if there's a house that is going to put in a pool, we get flagged, we get informed of this disturbance of the ground, and we determine, is this a high probability location where there's going to be a site? Do they need to do archaeology? What needs to be done in order to assure that this pool or this development is not going to destroy or impact either unknown archaeological resources or known archaeological resources? If we are working with historical structures, for example, we have a tax exemption program where you can have your house registered as historically significant and you get a tax credit, as long as the house maintains the historical qualities, right? So we want to ensure that if there's anything of historic value in the county, it's going to be preserved for future generations and such. Another part of our job is to promote. So once we identify and protect the historical and cultural and archaeological resources, we want to inform the public of what exists in Palm Beach County, and not just of what exists, but of its value. So we are always going on public outreach activities and conferences. We put together special programs, presentations. We also have an internship program. So if anybody's interested in our internship program, we work with college students, high school students, retirees, anyone who's interested in working in archaeology. either archaeological work, lab work, anything. We work with them to promote the knowledge of the resources and also so they know what we're doing to protect those resources. So before working for the government, I was in academia. Like I mentioned, I finished my PhD in 2018. And while I was getting my degree in Philadelphia, I always knew that I wanted to do my research in Puerto Rico. I wanted to contribute to my country's history and my field in my own country, right? So one thing led to the other, and I ended up doing research on 19th century slavery in Puerto Rico. So my dissertation research was the material culture of slavery, consumer identity, and social stratification in Hacienda La Esperanza in Manatí, Puerto Rico. Now, this topic, when you do a dissertation, you want to do original research, right? Something new, innovative. And this topic was not that. This is a topic that had been done many times in South United States and other islands of the Caribbean, but it hadn't been done in the Spanish Caribbean. It had been done in Cuba in some sites, and there were a handful of places in the Dominican Republic, but in Puerto Rico, it hadn't really been done. So I thought, okay, well then if Puerto Rico or the Hispanic Caribbean is going to join the conversation that already exists internationally, the research needs to be done. So my goal was to join an existing conversation. So my dissertation was on the human experience during enslavement in 19th century Puerto Rico, which was actually one of the last 3 localities to outlaw slavery in the Americas. And a lot of people don't know that. Because it abolished slavery so late, it actually had very specific qualities when it came to joining this conversation that I mentioned, right? So, sorry. So because all the other countries were abolishing slavery and ending the monoculture plantation, the big slave plantations, right? There was a shortage in sugar. So Puerto Rico planters were like, okay, well, then we can take over now because we still have slavery. So there was a very intense but short cycle of sugar production in in the late 19th century in Puerto Rico. So the intensified cultivation of sugarcane obviously allowed for the slave trade and slavery to continue in Puerto Rico, even though it was supposed to be already illegal. Spain had abolished slavery and the slave trade in 1820, but it kept on going in Puerto Rico because they needed the workforce to, grow their sugar. Most of our knowledge of these populations and their experiences in Puerto Rico usually come from official historic sources. Unfortunately, history is written by the powerful. So when we talk about slavery, especially in the Spanish Caribbean, they're only writing down the information that they think is pertinent to them, right? To the landowners, the people that are making the sugar. They don't want to know about the experiences of the enslaved. So when we want to learn about their daily lives, historical archaeology is a really good resource for that. And as archaeologists, we know that not all history is supported by documents, right? So so if we want to find out about about someone who's underrepresented, archaeology is really good for that. So, like I mentioned, archaeology is a powerful tool that can help us either obtain unknown information or challenge the official narrative. And that's more specifically what I was trying to do with my research, because we did have information of the enslaved in Puerto Rico, based on the official accounts, but we knew that wasn't either the whole story or it wasn't the right story. So in this case, I was looking at the material culture to find out about their daily lives, because the material culture can provide us a direct story of their daily lives and experiences that are absent from the historical documents. Now, what is historical and material culture? So material culture is anything in our physical environment that can be modified through culturally determined behavior. Because culture usually tends to determine what we find beautiful, important, valuable. Now, there's other things that determine your accessibility, right? So you can find something valuable, but you might not have the resources to acquire it. So then we have to look at genre, race, social status to determine the accessibility to certain goods. But if you have the accessibility to certain goods, then your culture is going to guide within your options, your decision. So that's what I was looking into. So by looking at someone's possessions, especially personal artifacts, we can examine their lives and learn about the condition of the individual. So my research showed that material life, even under enslavement, was able to provide a record of agency, self-determination and expression, and resistance that provided a new side to the already existing narrative. So my study was Hacienda La Esperanza in 19 sugar plantation in the municipality of Manatí on the north coast of the island. So at the beginning of the 19th century, the hacendados, the landowners, they began establishing these large monoculture sugar plantations on the northern coast of Puerto Rico. They took over the whole fringe on the north of the island. And one of these hacendados was Captain Fernando Fernández Velano. He was a military man from Santander, Spain, who was a wealthy merchant, and he was also a slave trader. So he was importing his own slaves. In the 1830s, Fernández purchased land in Manatí, in the Rio de Manatí Valley, and he established Hacienda La Esperanza. So this is the main house of Hacienda La Esperanza, and this is the valley. This is the Rio de Manatí. So this right here is the original land. So after he died in the 1850s, Don Fernando left the hacienda to his eldest son, José Ramón Demeterio Fernández y Martínez. So after José Ramón inherited La Esperanza, he purchased the smaller farms around La Esperanza. So by 1873, he had made 14 purchases, and La Esperanza measured now more than 2,000 acres. So it was actually one of the largest properties on the north coast of the island, and one of the properties that was producing the most sugar. So he quickly became one of the wealthiest men in Puerto Rico and the Spanish Caribbean, and he was later given the title of Marqués de la Esperanza. He was an absentee owner. He wasn't there. He wasn't involved. He was very involved in politics. So he had a mansion right next to the governor's house in Old San Juan. And he was always very active in his political career, trying to abort the abolition of slavery. He would rather be a politician than a farmer. So most of the information available on the slave population of La Esperanza comes from census records. Now, the early census records for Manatí, they usually just say the total amount of enslaved people in the region. So we don't really have specific information for La Esperanza, but so we know in the that the father, he purchased the land in 1830s. So let's say he took a couple of years to set it up. So this jump from 412 to 514 is when I think we can see the first increase in the regional population of him importing the slaves for La Esperanza. Now, the census of 1870 gives us a lot more information. It shows us, yes, there were 152 people enslaved in La Esperanza, but it shows us there were 100 male, 52 were female. We also have their profession or their chore. So if you were not on the specialized and semi-specialized list, you were field hand. So that means that of 152, most of them, including the women, were field hands. And these in this list had a specialized job. We can also see the ages. So 11 were 11 years or younger, 74 were between the ages of 12 and 40, and 60 were over the age of 41. Now, what I find the most interesting in this census is that it also specified who were bozales. Now, bozales is the Spanish term for African-born slaves who did not speak any Romance language. So that means they were first generation brought from Africa during the slave trade. Now, this is 1870. So the slave trade supposedly ended in 1820. And if we look at the ages, I mean, if they were brought in in 1820, let's say they were, I don't know, let's say in their teens, it's not possible, right? So that means that the fact that they're classified as bozales in 1870 and we got 53 of them, that means that they were illegally brought in after the legal slave trade. And since we know that the father had a slave trade boat, it's possible that he was bringing them in illegally. So we also know that because the son was active in the politics, he had been allowed to establish his own port, and he didn't have to report to the authorities what he was bringing in. So obviously he was bringing in slaves. If we look at this same time, the general population in Puerto Rico, 10% of the general population of enslaved workers in Puerto Rico were bozales. 35% of the enslaved people in Hacienda La Esperanza were bozales during the same time. So another important information that we get is through the protection board. So during this time, because Puerto Rico was really trying to not have slavery abolished, they said, okay, well, we'll set up a protection board where we're going to, slaves can go and like present complaints, and the owners are going to be dealt with. They were trying to prove that we're not so bad. We don't need to end this. Of course, we know that that was not the case. So the slaves from Hacienda La Esperanza were actually pretty vocal about their concerns, and the board, there wasn't any property in the region that had as many complaints as La Esperanza. So the overseers, because of the complaints, we know that the overseers and the marquis were constant violators of the regulations meant to protect the enslaved. But because the marquis was so well connected politically, usually it was just like a slap on the wrist, or, pay a couple of fines and go on. And if we look at the third complaint, Castro, which was one of the overseers, he says, like, I don't owe obedience to the mayor, but only to the Marqués de la Esperanza. He wasn't afraid of the mayor. He wasn't afraid of the fines. He was afraid of his boss. So we know how ruthless the Marquis was. So let's get into my research, right? So my research was done in 5 stages: the archival research, the preliminary assessment, archaeological excavations, artifact analysis, and the archaeological analysis. And I'm going to go over, the stages really quick and focus on the artifact analysis later on. So archival research is, the research you do before you start any investigation. You have to find out information about the site, the property, the owner, the people that live there, but you're also trying to acquire information of the previous excavations that have been done in the property. Now, Hacienda La Esperanza is one of the most researched plantations in Puerto Rico. They're still doing prehistoric archaeology there, and they'd actually done one of the largest historic archaeology projects there, but it hadn't been completely finished. They're still working there, and I'm supposed to be part of the project for next year. It's an awesome site, and there's so much information to still be obtained from there, but it was quite a task to acquire all the reports and all the information of everything that everyone had done. But that's the archival research stage. The preliminary assessment. So this map is from 1872. It was done by the Marquis, or it was commissioned by the Marquis. And with this map, I don't know if you can see it, but in the central plaza, you see there's some structures. So we used that to try and identify. I was looking for the slave barracks. So we were trying to verify. So the previous archaeologist, Gospantel, he had tried to verify if these buildings this map was for something that was meant to be built in the future, or if it was something that was there. So he concluded that most of the buildings that are on this map didn't really exist. It was apparently supposed to be for future construction. So this is a close-up, and the ones that are in dark lines, those are the buildings that show up on the map that don't exist today. The house is the main house. The house is there. There's the sugar mill. The sugar mill is there. And there's one structure that aligns with the previous buildings. That was the only one that could be confirmed. So then we decided to do a GPR. A GPR is a ground penetrating radar, which is a non-invasive mapping method that identifies anomalies underground. It sends like vibrations underground, and it bounces off if it hits something anomalous, right? And by the way, in the county, we do have our own GPR, and we train our interns on the use of GPR and running the grids. So if anyone is interested, please let me know. So by doing the GPR, I found clusters of anomalies. And that's what I used to decide where to put the excavation units. So we identified 4 locations we wanted to dig. So locus 1, just this one here, examined a ditch-like feature filled with debris. Locus 2, this one, examined an anomaly cluster that was interpreted as a possible brick floor or squared foundation. I don't know if you can see it here. This is B. And then locus 3 examined an anomaly cluster interpreted as a compacted dirt floor. And locus 4, I'm going to discuss later on. So for the artifact analysis, like I mentioned, this is a material culture study, so it was very in-depth. And if you let me talk about artifact analysis, I will take 10 hours, especially the micro artifact analysis. I will not put you through that. But the study had two artifact classification, right? So I used nested screens, and everything that was over 1/4 of an inch was a macro artifact, and it was divided between functional groups. Now, we divide into functional groups, not just to organize and classify, but also to make it easier to recognize patterns and to make comparisons. There were 8,860 macro artifacts recovered from Hacienda La Esperanza, and we divided them between household, personal, food-related or faunal remains, and architectural. The other category were the micro artifact. Everything under 1/4 of an inch and over 1/8 of an inch was water streamed and sampled and analyzed. And I love it. A lot of people think I'm insane because you're literally looking at teeny tiny things to find out stuff. But with this study, we actually identified the forge. So this type of study is very useful. So the geoarchaeological analysis, I also looked at the content of phosphates, magnetic susceptibility, and organic matter content as determined by loss of ignition. This is really helpful when you're trying to identify trash pits. You know, if it has a high organic content, it's most likely an in situ trash pit. Also, phosphates are really hard to leach from the ground. So if they're there, they're probably deposited there. So it's also very useful to identify in situ trash pits. So the findings, the goodies, the artifacts. Okay, so locus 1, this is the main house. So this would have been like right in front of the main house. The assemblage from locus 1 had a high concentration of household artifacts and food-related trash, which suggested the deposit was associated to a habitation structure. The site was not very, it was very shallow, and the concentration of stuff was intense. Like this was a very used trash heap. And these are some of the things that we found. We found the locks, human teeth, writing slate, hair comb, and smoking pipes, perfume bottles, and all sorts of things that I'm going to discuss later on. So in total in this location, we found 94 refined earthenware, porcelain, and stoneware food-related vessels. So this is the minimum vessel count, right? So 94 vessels. 19 coarse earthenware or food-related vessels. 3 were hand-built, unglazed, and low-fired pottery, which is this kind. 2 were decorated. 20 food or drink glass vessels. Glass that was napped and repurposed. That was very important. 23 buttons, 6 glass beads, 2 for perfume bottles, 11 smoking pipe fragments, and 2 were the handmade, low-fired kind with incised linear decorations. Those were very important as well. And 1,108 food-related faunal remains. So in general, when you look at the assemblage, it reflects a low economic status. So, and especially things like the repurposed glass, and I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but you can see the napping on the base. The use of repurposing the glass, having low-fired earthenware or handmade smoking pipes. These are things that in the rest of the Caribbean and the southern United States are immediately linked to slavery. So that, informed me that this trash heap belonged to the enslaved workforce in Hacienda La Esperanza. So we didn't exactly find the barracks, but we found a trash heap that was most likely associated with the slave barracks. So locus 2 contained a layer of brick and limestone mortar rubble that measured 2 by 2 meters. It was perfectly square. The artifact content was very, very fragmented. It most fell within the 1/4 and 1/8 screen. And that usually happens when it's a heavily transited area, like an entryway to a house, because things get very crushed of all the people coming in and out, right? So since the property map of 1872 placed a structure in this location, we might have not identified the structure. It could have been completely perishable, made of wood. It's not longer there, but this could have been a mud step or a landing entrance to said structure. And the function of the structure could not be determined based on the artifacts found. So the third locus exposed a limestone pathway. The previous archaeologists had already identified a bunch of pathways around the main house. If you see here, all these in gray were identified by Dr. Pantel, during his excavations in 2001 and 2002. So the fact that we found another one here and the trash heap was here in Unit 1, it's safe to assume that around in this location, there was a structure and most likely the slave barracks. And a lot of people were saying that it couldn't have, the slave barrack wouldn't be right in front of the house. Maybe in the south of the United States, usually no, they don't want to look at them. They have them far away. But in Puerto Rico, we do have cases where the slave barracks are right across from the house because they want to stand on this step right here and they want to look and supervise at all times. So the fact that it would have been right in front of the house is not that awkward. It's not that weird. So locus 4. Locus 4, like I mentioned, this structure is still there, still visible. So it was the only structure that was confirmed from the original map by Pantel. And when he excavated, this was the last thing he excavated, so he didn't really go into the structure, but he kind of delineated it. And he determined that it was most likely the kitchen, but didn't really get into detail and couldn't really dig there. So I wanted to confirm, is it the kitchen, or was it something else? The nursery, the hospital, what was it? So my goal was not to confirm the structure, but to confirm the use of the structure. So the first thing we found was a partition, the wall, and we found that on one side of the wall and on the other side of the wall had very different assemblages. So on the right of the wall, we found communal food things, right? Storage, food reserves. And on the left side of the wall, the tea set, the domino, the smoking pipe. So already we knew that the structure had different uses, between the rooms. And isn't that domino amazing? I love it. Okay, so locus 4 was identified as the right side of the room of the structure was the kitchen, and then the other side was the kitchen quarter, right, where the kitchen workers lived. So in locus 4, we found 47 refined earthenware, porcelain, and stoneware food-related vessels, 8 coarse earthenware food-related vessels, 2 were hand-built, low-fired, 16 glass vessels, again, repurposed glass, and this time it was actually worked into a tool, if you can see it here. And we found 4 glass beads, 15 smoking pipe fragments, 4 coins, and 2,109 food-related fragments. And again, the predominance of food-related refuse confirms that the structure was used as a kitchen, but also the amount of household artifacts on the other side of the wall indicate that the structure also included the living quarters of the enslaved individuals who worked in the kitchen and the house. Okay, so what kind of material goods were the enslaved population of La Esperanza consuming? I'm on time. So remember when I mentioned that in Puerto Rico, the fact that it ended so late had its different qualities? Well, this is end of the 19th century. This is really past the Industrial Revolution. So if we're looking at mass-produced goods, it's really difficult to compare the assemblage from slavery in Puerto Rico to slavery in the English Caribbean, because slavery ended earlier, before the mass-produced goods, arrived, to the hands of the slaves. So it was a little tricky trying to compare the assemblages. But in the 19th century, post the Industrial Revolution, mass-produced goods, all the ceramics were sorted into a price scale based on decoration types. So the transfer print decoration were the most expensive, this over here, followed by the hand-painted vessels, which are these. And then the minimal decoration, which is the the sponged, is over here, the dipped is over here, and the edged decoration were the less expensive, and then the undecorated was the absolute most inexpensive. So the assemblage from La Esperanza is composed 10% of the transfer print, 20% of the hand painted, and then the minimal decoration, which is the sponged, the dipped, and the edged, make up 44% of the assemblage, and only 18% is completely undecorated vessels. Now, what does this mean? Obviously, most of it is on the lower price ranges. So it's either the owner, who obviously doesn't want to spend too much money on his enslaved workforce, and he got the cheapest, which in that case, why didn't he just get the undecorated? Or the enslaved are buying their own things and buying things that they can afford, right? So if it's the second option, it means that they possessed capital and they were able to participate in the economy. So it was very important to try and determine, okay, so who was doing the purchasing, right? So I asked myself a couple of things. I was looking at I was looking at the decoration. So usually back then it was cheaper if you bought a crate, and crates came with patterns. So if you can identify patterns, okay, well then he purchased a crate. While if you don't find lots of sets, if you don't find sets, it means that the person was buying individual pieces, and the plantation itself wouldn't be buying pieces. So that would have been the consumer itself, the enslaved. So that's what I was looking at. So most of the patterns in the collection were single occurring decorative patterns. It means that we're buying single pieces and not sets. Now, when we did find sets, they were mostly of the edged, which is this one here, which is one of the most, the most economic, and they were flatware. So that was important too. So the European diet is focused around cuts of meat, one plate, one person, and they use obviously more plates than bowls. But the African diet, the Caribbean diet, usually it's communal eating. They use a lot of stews and soups, so they use more bowls. So then who was buying the edged plates? So I said, okay, well then these were probably being provided by the plantation, especially because there were sets. Okay, so that was fine. So then I was looking at the other categories, the dipped and the sponged, no flatware to be found. All of them were single decoration pieces with no sets, and all of them were hollowware. So So to me, that meant that these pieces were most likely being purchased by the enslaved to adjust to their own diets, right? So out of the collection, there were 55 hollowware and 49 flatware vessels. Now this ratio significantly higher shows a significantly higher dependence on liquid type meal other than the European tradition, right? So the two decoration types that lacked sets had no flatware. So then we arrived to the conclusion that they preferred for their own diet bowls over flatware. And if they were provided flatware, great, they were provided, but they would most likely go out of their way to acquire the bowls. Okay, so the other thing that I was looking into was how they were supplementing their diet. Because like I mentioned, so they were given flatware for the cuts of meat. They weren't necessarily given the cuts of meat. So another thing that's important to keep in mind about the soup and the stew diet is that it's great to render whatever food you do have available, right? So if you're giving a little bit of food and you make it into a soup, you can, make the best of it. So I was also looking at how other ways they were supplementing their diet. So they were obviously scavenging food in order to supplement the provisions. And we found that they were scavenging mollusks, land snails, crustacea, and small turtles from the faunal remains. And if you look at, so this is the plantation. So this is the plantation, and all the areas that are circled are the types of mollusks that we found where they're found. So that means that they didn't have to go that far to find these things, and they were probably collecting them while performing other tasks at each location. A lot of them were on the beach. Kids could have gone and scavenged this and then added them to a stew and to the diet. A lot of them are considered starvation food. What's the name? Like the sea cockroaches, those are considered starvation food, and we found a few of them on the collection. Okay. So another thing that made us think that they were acquiring things themselves is the court proceedings specifically mentioned that the Marquis always failed to provide proper clothing to his workforce. So if he wasn't providing cloth, he wouldn't have been providing buttons, especially beads, right? So this suggests that the items that are present in the assemblage, or at least a significant portion of them, would have had to be acquired by the enslaved themselves. So another type of personal object that reflects a deliberate choice are the beads, right? Because the beads were not expensive, they were pretty cheap, but they lack practical functionality, right? If you have a little bit of money and you have things in front of you that you can choose, and if you choose a bead, it's because you want that bead, not because you need it. So it's an indulgence. So it was very important that these were identified in the assemblage because it demonstrates a choice. So aside from the important goods, the enslaved workers of La Esperanza also consumed locally made goods. We found the handmade low-fired earthenware cooking vessels. We found no pots, no pans. So if the plantation wasn't providing cooking vessels, it's most likely that they were going out of their way to acquire the locally made cooking pots so they could, cook their own food. And most of the handmade low-fired earthenware, most of them had charring, so they were definitely using them for cooking. So one of the things that I wanted to do was compare, how did it compare to plantations in the rest of the Caribbean? And like I mentioned, it was difficult to do that comparison because of the time frame. So because Puerto Rico abolished slavery so late, it was very difficult to create solid parameters to make the comparison. So what I figured was that we would have seen a progression. In the earlier plantations, there was already a change to mass produced goods, but obviously they made up a very small component of the assemblage because it was still new, it was still early. So we were expecting that, okay, well then at the plantation in Esperanza, we would have seen a much sharper change So we were expecting to see like a much larger change. But what actually surprised me is that there wasn't. So the archaeological assemblages from late 18th century plantation sites, a century earlier, in the English Caribbean, they show a slow replacement of the coarse earthenwares by the mass-produced earthenwares, glass bottles, iron cooking pots, but La Esperanza showed more or less the same ratios. So, for example, in Drax Hall is a late 18th century plantation, right? It had 80% refined earthenware, 13.5 coarse earthenware, and then a 3.3 low-fired earthenware. You see, there's a change. They're completely leaving behind their earthenware and going to refined earthenware because of the Industrial Revolution. It was actually cheap. It was accessible. Marshall's Pen in New Montpellier in early 19th century, low earthenware is 1%. But when we look at the assemblage from La Esperanza, the low fire earthenware, and this is mid to late 19th century, it's 3.57. So it's still, the assemblage was actually more similar to 18th century sites in the English Caribbean than we would have expected. So I started looking at other sites from Cuba, and I found that other sites in Cuba had the similar distribution, like Oaxacas and La Dionisia. We were finding similar things, and also the amount of personal items was very low in the Spanish Caribbean. And when you were looking at end of slavery sites in the English Caribbean or the Dutch Caribbean, they had the French Caribbean specifically, they had a lot more personal items than we were seeing in the late 19th century in the Spanish Caribbean. So to me, that meant that the workers in the Spanish Caribbean had much less access to capital and market goods than their counterparts in the English and French Caribbean. Now, this was important because, like I mentioned, during this time, Spain was trying to promote themselves as the good slave owners, right? They were trying to avoid being forced into abolishing slave. So their propaganda was that their slave code was actually better. And the slave code was better. The slave code had, if you looked at the English slave code, it was all about punishment, and the individual enslaved was chattel. The Spanish code said that they were, children under Christ, and they deserved to be married and be kept with their families, and they shouldn't be punished. But in reality, they didn't follow the code. It was violated constantly. So what was written said one thing, but when we look at the assemblage, it was completely different, right? They were in worse conditions in the Spanish Caribbean than in the English Caribbean, even though the English slave code was the worst of them all. And this is one way where historic archaeology can help go beyond the document, right? So that was my research. And then I moved to Florida. So I want to talk about the switch, right? Because I feel like whenever I tell people I'm a historic archaeologist, they're like, why are you in Florida? And I feel that if you do archaeology, it can be applied to anything. Obviously, it takes a lot of research and reading and informing yourself about the material culture of that specific location. But to me, it actually showed me a very important point. So yes, I went from Puerto Rico archaeology to Florida, from historic to prehistoric, to enslaved populations to Native Americans. But to me, Native Americans in Florida, especially in Palm Beach County, are still an underrepresented group, and they're missing from the record. So to me, it made a perfect transition, and my work plan, I feel like, hasn't really changed. When we talk about Palm Beach County, the archaeology in Palm Beach County, this area is actually one of the least researched in Florida, right? If we look at what this area, how it's defined. So if we look at Millennium and Fairbanks, they just called it glades. If we looked at Carr and Burial, they called it East Okeechobee area. If we looked at Griffin, it's just unclassified, undetermined. And I think, who was it? I think it was Pepe, I think, or was it? Can't remember who it was that defined this area by this cultural area is an enigma that is distinguished by its indistinctiveness, and that is Chris's favorite quote, because that's the area we work in. It's a gray area. Now, the lack of knowledge and understanding in this area makes people move the boundary, right? No one has really defined it. And if they define it, they define it in comparison to other groups. So they're saying, because in this area, you can actually find ceramic from the Glades and St. John's. And, so they think it's either an area where everyone intersected, or it's an area that boundaries moved through time and it never really defined itself. So East Okeechobee area, the Belglade region, these are cultural chronologies that are not completely understood for this area, but it's because there's very few archaeological research that has been done. So Pepe's chronology, when we look at Pepe's chronology, he's saying that it's not a location thing, it's a time thing. So like earlier it was Timber Plain, and then St. John's, like moved down, and then we have Belgrade, and then, so he's saying that it's the boundaries have moved, right? But even with that, the verification of his time frame is very problematic because not that many sites have been researched, and the ones that have been researched don't have strong enough artifact assemblages that can prove the reliability of these of this shift, right? So it's not, the problem is not the theory or the definitions, it's that there's a lack of data. So it was Wheeler. Wheeler is the one that classified this area or described this area as indistinctive. So the majority of authors have decided that they don't know what's happening in this area. So it has to be a separate cultural area, but they haven't really done enough research to define it further. So my job with the county and my job with Chris Davenport is to, and his job for the last, I think, 18 years, has been to find more sites in the county so that we can understand what's happening in the county, so that we can join the conversation. So the county and the people that work here can be part of that conversation and be represented in the general Florida archaeological conversation, right? So right now, and one of the main things that we're doing right now is working in the slough. So everyone thinks that there was no one in the slough. The Seminoles just, went in because they were running away from the Americans. But we're finding, first of all, we're finding archaic sites in the slough. And second of all, we tested 40 tree islands, 20 of which had sites. We're going to be digging during the summer 2 of these sites. And we're not talking about small sites, like dense sites. People were living in the slough. And that's something that needs to be discussed and included and, documented. So while a lot of people are like, oh my God, why did you switch? To me, I feel that it actually prepared me, my research with the enslaved actually prepared me to handle this type of research, because it's about joining the conversation, right? And giving a face and classification and identification to a group that is lacking that information right now. Any questions?
Thank you, Nydia. So does anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself and say whatever you want to say to Nydia, or you can just write it down in the chat if you prefer to. How long did it take you to do your research? That's a great question.
So I was working full time when I was doing my research. So I had to go during the summers and during the winter to Puerto Rico. So I think I think my first season was summer 2012. The second was winter 2012. And then I did a third and a fourth. So it was 2 years, but 4 field seasons because I was working full time. And then the lab work, all the analysis took a lot more.
I wanted to ask you, was there, and maybe you touched on this, and I apologize if you did, was there any evidence of any trading between other towns on the archipelago that you found, or maybe other parts of the Caribbean?
So I wanted to look into that because there's no proof that the low fire earthenware was made in Puerto Rico. There is proof that it was made in other islands. So I wanted to do a postdoc so that I can research that. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. But that's one of the theories, right? So we haven't found any, pottery shops in Puerto Rico for it. They think there might be one in Old San Juan when they were digging in Valleja. But I don't know what happened with that. But yeah, so they think that usually most of the pottery was done in the smaller Antilles. So it would have to be tested.
That's super interesting. And I love so much that you and the rest of the team at Palm Beach County are continuing to do a lot of archaeology of the Everglades, because I feel like there's still so much to unpack, so much.
Oh my God.
And I am currently in Everglades City. And I often come here and to do the talk of archaeology of the Everglades. And the people that come to the talk have the most incredible questions. And I'm always like, some I can answer the questions, some are like, cool, that would be a wonderful research question. I don't know. So the fact that you guys are now going to start, doing your next field work season, you're going to excavate the slough?
The Loch Slough, yeah. The Loxahatchee Slough.
There we go. I kind of I feel like we're gonna have to invite you for another virtual Cafecito lecture throughout the year, just to learn about updates into the archaeology of the Everglades. And hopefully I can update and be able to update my presentation and be able to better tell that story. So again, thank you so much for giving us both the perspective of your work and your incredible research on 19th century slavery in Puerto Rico, and your perspective on and how working in Puerto Rico has helped you as an historical archaeologist do your work currently as Palm Beach County archaeologist. So I know both Joyce and I loved your presentation. So, echoing the words of Joyce, thank you so much, Nydia, once again for joining us and for, we say in Spanish, cerrar con broche de oro. We are
de nada.
The very first Honrando Nuestra Historia series. I think it was the most wonderful way to close all of this series of events with the work that FPAN does. Know that you can go to our website fpan.us, or you can follow us on any platform on social media, and I'm happy to continue these conversations with you. So thank you so much. Hope everybody enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thank you for having me.